When Hollywood needs a director who can do big action, there's one man they keep turning to. Simon West has brought us blockbuster movies like Con Air, Lara Croft Tomb Raider and Expendables 2. But ironically, it was directing upbeat music videos and commercials with a comedic touch that got his directorial career started. Simon talks about his early love of film, his career in Hollywood, his new Spanish language miniseries for Amazon, and how his little video for Rick Astley has never said goodbye. Enjoy. Hi Simon, welcome to the pod.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's good to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices flowing. And so my question to you is this. If you could remake any film that you loved when you were growing up or from your early years, which one would you choose?
Well, it's always hard, the prospect of remaking something you love, because the reason you love it is it's that movie is how it was made and who made it makes it part of why you love it. But I would have to say it would be Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, just because it was such a inspirational film to me as a kid, and it made me interested in film. It's one of the first things I saw at the cinema, and it was so magical and inventive. And also after it was made, I was actually, for some reason, my father knew the person that had the car after the film. So I got to sit in the car when I was probably 7 or 8. And I've got an old 16mm film that my father took of me and my sisters sitting in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And I lost it for years, and I thought that was that. And then I was digging around after moving and through boxes and in a garage, and I found this old roll of 16mm film that was all water damaged and splodges on it, and had it transferred. And sure enough, it was the me sitting in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So that's the film I'd love to remake, just because it'd be so fun to do it. But I'm sure my version wouldn't be as good as the original. I mean, you couldn't really top it. So.
Growing up in Hertfordshire in the UK, how big a role did cinema and film have in your life? And at what point did you decide this was going to be your chosen career?
Well, I fell in love with film, and it really was film. It wasn't necessarily watching things on TV or something. It was actually film, because my father had an 8mm camera to start with, and was sort of an avid amateur photographer and filmmaker with that. And he sort of turned our kitchen into a dark room and processed stills in there. So I remember the smell of the chemicals. But he also shot Super 8. Well, it wasn't Super 8, it was Standard 8 film actually at that time. It was actually on rolls. That's one of my earliest memories, probably like 3-4 years old, was him putting the screen up in the kitchen and getting the projector out, and the noise of it. Obviously, there was no sound on it, but it was just the noise of that projector and the dust burning in the lamp, that smell, and just seeing the sort of flickering images on a screen in the kitchen. And I thought it was magical, and it must have gone into my subconscious at that, very early age, 3 or 4. And I suppose that was my falling in love with film. And then growing up in Letchworth, Garden City, we had we had 2 cinemas, one called the Broadway, which was the classy Art Deco one. And then we had one called the Palace, I think it was called, which was a bit more seedy, and I think, played horror movies rather than the main movies. And amazing that, in one street, there were 2 cinemas in this small town. And the Broadway was where I used to go and watch all my films on a Saturday as a kid. And again, it was like musty old red velvet seats and the smell of hot dogs. And it was one huge screen. And I think it might have even, it had a balcony above it. So it was like a very big purpose-built 30s cinema. And every Saturday I'd go and see films there. I'd go with my friends, and then I'd go with girls, and then I'd just go on my own, because people would say, like, you go to the cinema on your own? I go, well, yeah, it's fantastic watching a film on your own. Because normally if you go with your mates when you're young, they're messing about, and I got thrown out a couple of times for messing about. But if you're really interested in film, you sit there and watch it in the dark. So sure enough, when I made my first Hollywood film with Con Air, I sort of asked if we could have the UK premiere of it back in that same cinema, the Broadway in Letchworth. And so they kindly, the studio, Disney, set it all up, and we got all family and friends down there in buses, and it was up on the marquee outside, which was great because I'd grown up looking at other people's films like James Bond films and things like that written up there, and then there was my film up. And I went in the premiere, and then the manager proudly took me to the inside to show me around the projection room and everything, and it had been turned into a multiplex inside. So I was like, oh, that was a shame. I thought it was going to be the same old seats and the same old screen, but it would all be modernized inside, and there was like 3 or 4 screens, much smaller. But it was just a thrill to have my film eventually show on the screen that I grew up watching films on.
And when did it become a career option?
Well, I mean, when I was about 11 or 12, I sort of got serious about actually doing something about it. And I inherited my father's films. I found them one day because he actually died when I was 9. So I never got to sort of teach me the ins and outs of it. But I actually sort of found in a drawer all his old films, and I had nothing to show them on because all his equipment had gone by that time. So I got a paper round and saved up and bought for £5 a projector so I could actually watch the films again. And that got me reignited. So I, kept working and saved up some more money and actually bought a little Super 8 camera, which again, I still have, and started making my own films on those. And so from like 12 years old, I just was shooting Super 8 film. And then when I was 16, I got a chance. I moved to Oxfordshire, and they had an Oxford Filmmakers Workshop there, and they had 16mm equipment. So at 16, I started using the sort of bigger format. I was really, so obsessed with it and precocious, really. I mean, I read every book, I watched every film. I thought I knew everything about it. And so I boldly applied to the BBC when I was 18, because at that time, there weren't really any film courses in England. There was the National Film School, which really only took postgraduates and only about 25 people a year. And that was it. And so the only place to get trained was really the BBC. They had a great training program. So I went along for the interview, and then one of the main questions was, what are you going to do if we say no? And I said, well, I'll just keep applying until you say yes. I'm just going to keep. And so they could see I was persistent. And luckily, I was very precocious about the technical side of filmmaking. And eventually they let me join as an assistant film editor, which at the time, I didn't really know the difference between all the functions, because as a kid, you just do everything. You shoot it, you write it, you direct it, you act in it, you edit it. And I didn't really know the differences between all the disciplines. And so I trained as an assistant film editor, but it actually was one of the best trainings, because at that time, BBC only took on, I think it was 12 trainees a year. And I was one of those 12. And I was much younger than everybody else. Everybody else had been at university or college, or had actually come from inside the BBC doing other jobs. So I was this sort of 18-year-old working with much older people. And it was completely professional. You had deadlines, you had to get stuff out on air, and you had to work in the real world. And that was kind of a shock. But the good thing about the BBC at that time is that they moved you around every department. So I was in documentaries, in drama, current affairs, arts documentaries, children's programs. So you spend, a few months in each one, and then you decide which department you want to end up in. And so I ended up in drama, and learned a lot in that from, the typical BBC costume dramas. And then I worked on sort of improvised drama with people like Mike Leigh directing, and Stephen Frears was there at the time. And, there's a whole corridor full of great directors, and I was learning my trade there, in the editing department. But I soon realized that I was still ambitious and wanted to get on really fast. So I started moonlighting outside and making my own films, borrowing the BBC's equipment. So we'd borrow a camera, go out the weekend with some other trainees and get little short ends of film from the BBC. And then we'd use their lab, and we'd slip a few quid to the sound department to transfer our sound, and get the graphics department to do our titles. Basically, I had the whole BBC working, as an underground studio for me and my friends, and making these sort of moonlight films outside. And one of the films I did got seen by the London Arts Association. They gave me a grant to finish it into a half-hour documentary. And I was sort of moonlighting there. And so I actually then transferred to work on Newsnight, because it was only 3 days a week, because you did long hours, because the show went out at 11 o'clock at night. So I'd be, you know, editing all day on that and literally running down the corridors with the film under your arm as they were announcing it on Newsnight, throwing it up, and then they would play it, and then I would get 2 days off and the weekend. So I had 4 days to make my own films. And so while I was doing that, the documentary it had a lot of music in it. So I started sort of making music videos out of the musicians who were in the film. And a couple of them got successful and got on Top of the Pops. And so I started actually doing that as a living. I mean, it wasn't much of a living, but in those days, £400 went a long way, which is what I got for each music video, basically. And I looked at how do I get into film? You know, I looked around like, how do I get into movies? And the business in the UK was quite bad at the time in, the late 80s, early 90s. But I looked at all the directors who'd made it in the UK, and they'd all gone through commercials. So it was Ridley Scott, Tony Scott, Alan Parker, Hugh Hudson, Adrian Lyne. All these English directors had made these fantastic big production commercials and then made it into movies. So I thought that's the way. So I edited one of my music videos down into a fake commercial, a fake beer commercial. And then I joined a company that made commercials, Steve Barron's company Limelight. And I did a couple of commercials in the UK, but even the commercial business was a bit hard to break into then. But they had a US office in LA, and they said, do you want to go and try and work through the US office? And I, well, that's in Hollywood. You know, that's right in the middle of where I want to be, making Hollywood movies. So I said, yeah, I went over there and with my one test commercial under my arm, which happened to be sort of a comedy commercial. And I gradually started getting, well, I think I arrived in LA with, again, like $200 or $300 in my pocket and this one test commercial. And so sort of did starve for a little bit, but then I got, a couple of little jobs and bigger jobs. And eventually it sort of took off, and I was doing Super Bowl commercials, which are like the zenith out there of the big brands like Budweiser and Pepsi and people like that. And that sort of got me noticed. And ironically, I did comedy commercials. I mean, that's all I did. I was known as the comedy guy because I came with this one comedy commercial, and I just got offered those. And I was doing, like 25 comedy commercials a year. And they because really they were good practice. They had actors in them. They had dialogue. They were little films, whereas a lot of commercials were very image orientated and were about cars going on beaches and models on mountainsides and things like that, which were just very, beautifully shot, but not really storytelling in a movie kind of way. But ironically, I got offered a one commercial, which wasn't, it did have some comedy in it, but then the second part of the commercial was all action, and it was set on a US Navy aircraft carrier. So we landed on this aircraft carrier on an airplane, which is terrifying, getting caught by the cable. And we got out and we were shooting this thing. And I was thinking, well, the best footage or best images I've seen of this is Top Gun. And, Tony Scott had shot this incredible footage on this aircraft carrier. So basically, I based this commercial on the Top Gun aircraft carrier sequence. And we were, on the deck with handheld cameras and planes taking off over our heads and being blown off the side almost. And it was, action, action, action. And it ended up being on the Super Bowl. And I think that's when I got the call from Jerry Bruckheimer to come in and have a meeting to talk about doing a film, because obviously he produced Top Gun, the original. And I don't know if he'd seen all my other, 100, 200 comedy commercials, but he'd seen this action commercial. And I wasn't really an action director, but he said, I really love to make a movie with you, and gave me 3 scripts to read and said, choose one of these and let's go and make a movie. And I thought, oh, this is dream come true. And by sheer chance, the same week, I'd sort of been noticed by Sony Pictures, who sent me a romantic comedy, and UK company who'd sent me a European spy thriller. And I had one weekend to read all these scripts and decide by Monday which one I was going to take. And 2 of the Jerry Bruckheimer ones were very straight ahead action, which, as I said, I wasn't really an action director. But the third one was Con Air. And it was like a small indie character-driven thing. I mean, the characters in it were so good, and there was a lot of very dark humor in it, which appealed to me. So I came in on Monday and said, I want to do this one called Con Air. And as I said, it was quite a small film at that time, because the writer Scott Rosenberg had done Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead and Beautiful Girls, and they were, small, character-driven, great little films. And Con Air at that time was a bit like that. It was quite small. And, Jerry Bruckheimer does not make small films. He wanted a summer blockbuster. So he said, now you've got to make this thing into a summer blockbuster. You've got to enlarge it. So I had to go through and basically take every situation I could and see how I could blow it up out of all proportion. And that's sort of why it ended up sort of being operatic and, completely over the top. And to my mind, a comedy really, because as I said, that was my natural reflex, was comedy. And the action, I sort of really had to learn as I went along, because I'd never shot any footage with anybody with a gun. I'd never shot anyone punching anybody. I'd never shot a fight. I'd shot comedy and sort of dance routines. So it was a huge learning curve, but, one that I really enjoyed and had strangely enough, a lot of artistic freedom on it, because I think Jerry was very keen on taking people and letting them run with it. He'd had success before with commercials directors like Tony Scott. And he was very keen on, you bring your team with you, you bring your creativity. And so Con Air, I had a huge amount of creative freedom and also the resources to sort of execute the ridiculous situations that, I thought up. So it was a dream come true, really.
And I guess there was a lot of pressure around that film. I mean, there's pressure on Bruckheimer because I think this was his first film since he'd made the split from Don Simpson, and the pressure of the studio and the budget and everything. So there's quite a lot of moving pieces there.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge pressure. Anybody's first film is pressure filled. I'd only known Jerry as a sole producer, and so I wasn't conscious that this was his first outing as solo. And so I probably, only realized that sort of years later that, wow, that was actually quite a brave thing for him to do. And also very brave to take on a first-time director to do that with. I mean, it was like catastrophically brave, but it worked out in the end. But I mean, there definitely was trials and tribulations on my side of people wondering whether you could do it or not. I mean, I had a huge amount of flying hours shooting film. I shot many commercials all around the world in every situation, underwater, up mountains, out of helicopters. As I said, worked with actors and all sorts of situations. And so I could run a crew like a proper captain, but never on that scale, because, when you do a commercial, you're usually shooting 1, 2, 3 days. If it's a big commercial, you might go a whole week. But this was 100-day shoot, and with a giant cast, and every day was a spectacle. We were crashing a plane one day, we were flipping cars the next, had huge dialogue scenes with actors in incredible tense situations, and high drama, then comedy. It was a lot to handle, and keeping an emotional thread through it, so it wasn't a total cartoon. And I'd say sort of 50% of the people on the set were supportive and 50% on the set were not, and thought, this guy shouldn't be here doing this. So I really just concentrated on the people that were supportive and helped me make the film, and and just prove the other 50% wrong. I don't know if it was 50%. I was probably 80-20, but definitely I had to face a few people down and say, actually, this is what we're going to do, because I have been given this job to direct this film. So today we are doing this, even if you don't want to, and you don't think I can do it. But nevertheless, I've got the uniform. So until they fire me, you kind of have to follow the orders. What I didn't realize was that the studio has a list of your replacement. If after 2 weeks they don't like the rushes, they know exactly who the next person they're going to is to step into your shoes. Thank goodness I didn't know that. It might have, given me the jitters. But definitely, you're on, under scrutiny there, and you do have to keep proving yourself. But, I made it through, and luckily it's a film that people like, and, it got me my next job as well. So really, you're only as good as your last film, as they say. And so you're really just hoping this film will get you another one.
And that one and the following one were both $100 million at the US box office movies, General's Daughter and Lara Croft Tomb Raider. And I think, in fact, you're the only live action director ever whose first 3 films all grossed over $100 million at the US box office. So that was a fantastic run. And there are so many elements that make a film successful. The director, DOP, the crew, the dating by the studio, and the marketing activity and choices that they make. Are there certain elements that are more important than others, or is it really all of these things have to come together to make a great release?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that I think, a film is, it's like 10,000 decisions, and you have to try and get as many of them right as possible. I mean, obviously, some of them, those decisions are much more important than others. It's like, it starts with the script. Is the script any good? Or if it's pretty good, can you make it good by the time you've shot it? Can you improve it? And I always think, that's part of the director's job, is to make the script better. Or if it's, if it's a gorgeous script, then to make sure you don't damage it and get it onto the screen. But there is obviously the ticket items. There's the script, then there's the casting, and then there's how you direct it. The other things about when it's released, and those are so obscure to me, the marketing side and everything, that I can't even really focus on that. My job is to make a good film. It's a whole different group of people that decide how it gets out there. But casting, what I find very interesting is I generally think there's a lot of films you could cast 3 or 4 different ways and they'd all be great films. If you've got great actors, and I've been really lucky that coming in at such a high level, I've sort of worked with the top people straight away, and just to work with those people and see them, their skill level is remarkable. But you do also realize that there's several versions of that film could be made with different actors. I mean, I remember on The General's Daughter, the original idea was Russell Crowe for the lead, and because he'd just done LA Confidential and had sort of broken in that film, and I thought he was phenomenal in that film, but the studio thought he could only play bad guys, and this was a leading good guy role, and he was very economical at that time. He wasn't a very expensive actor, but he was like just about to explode, and I said, this guy is going to be great, we should have him as the lead. But the studio weren't confident, and so we see him as more of a bad guy. So they said, who's next on your list, basically? And I said, well, it's John Travolta. I said, but he's like 5 times more expensive, and we don't even know if he wants to do it and all that. And they said, okay, yeah, fine. He's he plays good guys, and he's an A-lister, yeah, and here's the money, go and get him. And it was like, what? And then so you have to shift in your head how you see the film one way, and then you're a completely different actor. And then so I studied John's films, and I see what made him a movie star and why he was so good. And I go, oh, okay, this guy's got the magic. He's got the sparkle. He's got the twinkle in the eye. And most of all, he's got the humor. And when you're doing a very dark story like The General's Daughter was, it was really important to have humor, because the original script I read that Paramount had been developing for 9 years from the book was a great story, and but it was a little dry, and I thought I better go back and read the book. And I read the book, and it was full of humor, full of dark gallows humor that wasn't in the movie, in the screenplay at that time. So literally 4 weeks before starting shooting, I said, I want to do a dialogue polish on this script. So I got Scott Rosenberg back in, who'd done Con Air, and we went through the book, and I literally highlighted with a highlighter everything in the book I liked, all the lines, all the situations, and we just lifted them straight out of the book and put them in the screenplay. And the humor, level went way up. As I said, I was a comedy director, and even when doing like a dark drama, I felt it needed it. And then you put those lines in John Travolta's mouth, and he just makes them, sing, and could really play with it. And it really helped the audience, because watching a very dark story, it can get really traumatic and stressful for the audience, and you really need to lighten the mood every now and again. And every time it was getting really heavy and the audience was sort of gripping the arms of their chairs, Travolta would come out with one of these great lines, and the whole room would lift and let the air out and relax again and enjoy the film again. And so that's why I firmly believe that there's lots of different people can play a part in a movie, and you just have to make sure you tailor the part to. You can't force them into a character that is wrong for them. You just have to modify the part to that actor to get the best out of the actor, because that's kind of, how I operate with actors, is because, again, working with some of the best people in that business, my job is not to teach them acting or to tell them how to do it. It's to create an environment that they do their best work, and me working out what do they need to do their best work, because they're obviously all at the top of their game. I mean, this stuff, obviously there's smaller actors and newer actors that I do have to do much more work, and it's much more tiring and everything. But with the kind of big A-listers, there's a reason they're at the top of their game, is because they're so good at it. So I really have to learn the personalities of each one. And something like Con Air, I did it very quickly, because Nicolas Cage, John Cusack, and John Malkovich could not be more different actors and completely different personalities. And you have a scene with three of them in the room, and I shoot them one by one. I really have to modify what each one needs to get the best out of them. And whether that's lots of takes, or it's very few takes, or it's a very simple camera movements and techniques, so they're not overwhelmed by it, or it's giving them a lot of time to prepare, or don't want any time to prepare, just want to do it off the cuff. But whatever it is, I kind of learn their technique, and so they can feel really comfortable doing their part and not being forced into a hole that they're not used to.
And Lara Croft Tomb Raider, I think, was another example of where casting was an important element, because I think that Angelina Jolie was not necessarily the first choice for that role. That's certainly what I read, and others were suggested, but I think you pushed quite hard for her to take on that role.
Yeah, I mean, I had to fight very hard for Angelina, because I really believed in her. And at that time, she'd played very worthy roles in sort of more independent films and very dramatic films. And, we were making a summer blockbuster again, and that character was the lead of the film. And so at that time, there hadn't really been a female lead of an action adventure film. And if there was going to be one, a lot of people, studio producers, wanted somebody with a very big name who had proved themselves with opening several big films. So, there was a long list of people that they wanted before Angelina. So I had to fight quite hard for her. And part of the reason I wanted her was because she had a kind of a dark edge. She wasn't this goody two shoes who, squeaky clean. Her private life was kind of quite notorious and interesting. And, she was a very unusual person and lived life, to the full, and was, had a lot of baggage, really, and I wanted some of that dark edge to come with her. So when people saw, Angelina Jolie's playing Lara Croft, God, this is going to be interesting. She's not your normal cookie cutter female lead, because, most of the time in the past, an action adventure film, the female part had been the sort of sidekick who was dragged along by the big hunky guy who was, doing all the action. And this was going to completely rest on her shoulders. And, I knew she was a fantastic actress, and I wasn't even sure she wanted to do it, because, again, she was a serious actress. And this was asking her to come on into the sort of the belly of the beast in Hollywood and go into that summer bubblegum world that was sort of a lot of fun. But, some actors shy away from it, especially in those days. Not so much now, but in those days. And so I went down. She was on a filming in Mexico, and I went down to Mexico to visit her on the set, and was sort of basically trying to persuade her to be in it. So, back in Hollywood, I was trying to persuade the studio and the producers to take her, and down there in Mexico, I was trying to persuade her to take the part. And luckily, I could see there was some reticence, and I said, look, this is a role model, and this is really unusual. This doesn't come along very often, a female lead in an action adventure film, and you could be a real role model for girls and young women that can change things. And that's when I think I saw her, the spark in the eye, and go, yes, I want to do that. And she threw herself into it, and trained and changed her diet and built herself up in strength and studied all the techniques and became a superwoman, really, for that part. And I couldn't really imagine anybody else doing it. There wasn't anybody else that had that kind of energy and, dark edge that she does.
So that was 2001. And 2001 also saw one of my top 5 favorite movies from my time at Sony Pictures, which was the Ridley Scott directed film Black Hawk Down. Now, you were an exec producer on that film. Did being an EP show you another side of the business? And what was it like working with Ridley Scott? You mentioned him earlier, having come through the advertising background. Was it really fascinating to be on set with him? And also, was it different working with material that was based on real life events?
Well, Black Hawk Down was based on newspaper articles. I contacted the journalist who wrote them, Mark Bowden, and asked, could I buy the rights to his articles? Because it was a minute by minute account of the Black Hawk Down mission. And he said, well, I'm actually writing a book at the same time of this. And I said, oh, even better. Can I buy the book? And he said, well, I'm just finishing it off, but it's certainly, let's talk about it. So then I started ringing around all the studios in Hollywood, and I'd had some hit films, but no studio would take it. They looked and they went, oh, this is too political, too expensive. It's too risky for us. And in the end, I called up Jerry Bruckheimer and I pitched it to him, and he bought it like in 5 minutes on the phone and said, great, let's, love it. Let's do it. And so then I spent basically 2 years trying to turn that book into the script, because it's such a huge story. I think I worked out there were sort of 18 main characters and stories, and each one of their stories was fascinating. And so it was a real battle to sort of condense it down into a screenplay where you could follow, a coherent story. Anyway, so in the meantime, I went off to do Tomb Raider. And then just as I was thinking, I was in the last 2 weeks of shooting, and I'd been all over the world. I'd been in Iceland, I'd been in Cambodia, I'd been on stage. It was like 120 days shooting and everything. And I was absolutely, burnt out by that time. And I get the call from Jerry's office saying, we've got to go into production straight away on Black Hawk Down. Can you prep it while you're, finishing off the other film, the Tomb Raider? And I went, oh, this is a fantastic film. And I've spent years working on this script. But at the end of the day, I thought, and they said, if we don't make it now, it's never going to get made. It's such a tricky project, and to get finance for it. And there's a SAG strike coming. If we don't make it this, in the next 6 months, it's never going to get made. So I reluctantly went, oh, you know what? For the sake of the film, it's got to be made. Let's find another director, and I will just stay on as producer and go like that. Now I probably would have, said, look, let's just take 2 weeks until I've rested. But in those days, I was kind of quite purist. It was like, no, you should only do one film, finish it, take a break, and then start another film. So, of course, Jerry puts out the feelers for another director, and of course gets Ridley Scott, which is no shabby thing. But of course, Ridley Scott's one of the greatest film directors ever, and was a icon for me, and one of the reasons I went into film. And so there's no way I'm ever going to tell Ridley as a producer what to do or how to do it. And to be honest, I was still busy on finishing off Tomb Raider. So that's Ridley's film. He directed it and he did it how he wanted it to it. And maybe I would have directed it slightly differently, but I was happy that, I'd got it to that level, because it was such a difficult film to get onto the screen, to go from the articles to the book to a screenplay, that I was just happy that it got onto the screen. But there's no way I'm going to tell Ridley anything about filmmaking. I mean, he's my mentor and who I live up to, rather than that. So yeah, that's definitely his film, and he did a fantastic job, and rightly so, was nominated for it.
So you talked about working with different stars on Con Air, and when it came to Expendables 2 in 2012, you had a team of superstars. So it was Stallone, Willis, Schwarzenegger, the Stath, Jason Statham, Van Damme, Lundgren, Norris. I mean, it's an absolute panoply of super action talent. How do you manage so many talented people with so much energy, and at the same time doing all the killing stuff and the blowing up stuff? I mean, it's a lot to cope with.
Yeah, I know it was another big adventure, that film, but it's not as bad as you might think, because at the end of the day, again, these people are very good at what they do, and so they're glad to be there. Especially when they're sort of having a second blush. You know, a lot of these guys were big in the 80s and 90s, and probably, thought that they never get a chance to do that stuff again because they're older people now and not necessarily thought of as action people. And so when a chance to come along to do that, legitimately by inventing an idea that is older guys who can still do it, most of them are, really pleased to be there and, just having fun doing it again because they thought they would never get to do it again. But it was definitely, an interesting hierarchy with, Stallone and the guys below him because, some of them had worked with Stallone, like Dolph Lundgren had been in Stallone movies like Rocky films, and the other guys, Terry Crews and those like who weren't big action stars at the same time as Stallone and Chuck Norris and those people had looked up to those guys. So they were sort of in awe of them. So you had this sort of, respect from the newer guys to the older guys. And the older guys were just glad to be doing it. And then there's, people like Chuck Norris, who's basically a myth now, but he's the most charming man in the world, and he came in to do his guest spot and it was funny. And he told Chuck Norris jokes. I mean, the Chuck Norris joke in the film is one that he came up with. So they're just a bunch of guys really messing about. And it's, I once went to a dinner where the Rolling Stones were at not so long ago, and they're all, older men, but they're all still acting like they're teenagers and they're still fooling about and they don't really change. So it's the same with, the Expendables gang. They're just really a bunch of unruly guys and having fun what they do. So most of the time it's just making them concentrate, and say like, stop messing about. Let's shoot this thing so we can get out of the cold.
Alongside your feature film directing career, you've actually been active in TV for the last 20 years or so, directing multiple pilots for major US networks, including Fox, CBS, and NBC. Aside from the obvious budget and time length issues, what are the big differences, or are there many big differences between directing for feature film and TV? And is there anything particular about directing pilots that's different because you're setting the tone for the rest of the series, really?
Well, there is a lot of a speed issue with the film and doing pilots, because you do get a lot more time and resources than the episodes do, because you are setting the whole thing up. But it is really just like a small feature film. I mean, the other thing about it is it's very predictable because they have a very finite schedule. They make, every year they write the script at the same time of the year, they shoot them and then they show them and then maybe they'll get picked up. Whereas feature films can sort of drift out there for years, and maybe it'll be this year it'll get made, maybe next year, maybe we'll work on the script for 9 years. Whereas TV is much more organized, I suppose, and when everything's going to happen. But I liked it because it was a good way, after having learned a lot about filmmaking, to go in and see if you could keep the same standard up but go much faster. And also there's a little pride in it. People say, oh, you're a movie director, you can't shoot fast, you can only shoot 1 minute a day. And go like, look, the reason we shoot what we shoot is because we have 500 trucks out there. It's moving the crew that takes the time, not the shooting necessarily. So if I have a small crew on a TV shoot, I can go just as fast as anybody. So there's a little bit of that pride of like, I can shoot as fast as anybody else. But it's nice to set up a series and set a look, and then if it gets picked up, then you see it sort of running on TV, and they're sort of sometimes it's a little strange because they're changing things, and you say, well, those are my actors, why are they working with my actors and those characters? And so it's a little strange. I mean, a couple of times I've stayed on to executive produce and been there for every episode as a producer, and that's more fun because you get to orientate the episodic directors and you get to stay with the actors and you get to develop the long-term stories. So it's another discipline, but I still prefer movies in a way because they're just unique one-off items, little gems that you can put on the shelf and exist in their own right.
And you're back in TV though with Boundless, which is the latest release. It's a mini-series in Portuguese and Spanish that tells the story of the first ever circumnavigation of the globe by Magellan. How did you come on board the project? It's working in a language in predominantly Spanish, some Portuguese, I think, but clearly not English, working with a Spanish production company. So that must be quite a different experience.
Well, I mean, originally I was brought the project 4 or 5 years ago, and the intention was to make it as a feature film in English as a Hollywood film. And this was a story that had never been told. The world didn't know really what happened. Hollywood was going to tell it, and we were going to have English speaking cast and, as you might expect. And then, of course, we take it around to try and get it financed. And it's really difficult to get it financed because it's period. It's 500 years old. It's true, which in some way, it's not fantasy. So there's no dragons and there's no, mystical elements that don't really exist. It's everything has to be real. And it's a story of a Portuguese character who worked for the Spanish. So in Hollywood's eyes, that's probably kind of obscure story. So eventually Amazon in Spain came in to say that they would finance it. And obviously they would prefer a series to a single movie. And also they would prefer it to be in Spanish if possible. And I was at the time I was a bit dubious. I was thinking, well, this will make it a smaller appeal to the world. But then when I got into the actual production of it, I realized, we were going to have to make a decision if we were making in English, how everyone was speaking. Was everyone going to have a Spanish accent or a Portuguese accent? But then what happens when they go between the two? Are the Portuguese speaking to the Spanish in English, but with weird accents? And then when they go to the indigenous tribes around the world, what are they speaking? Are they also speaking in English with strange accents? And they all became very fake. So in the end, I embraced it, and everybody speaks whatever language they should be speaking. So the Portuguese speak Portuguese, the Spanish speak Spanish. There's an Italian character on it who speaks Italian every now and again. There's a Moluccan character who can speak all the languages and drifts between them. And then the indigenous tribes all speak their languages. And so it's much more authentic from that point of view, because you're not saying, wait a minute, why are they all speaking in English with weird accents? And, I prefer watching things with subtitles if they're in another language. But these days, anyway, people just press the button and it clicks onto whatever language they want anyway, in whatever country they're watching. But I felt it gave a great authenticity to it. And it's not that difficult because all the actors spoke English and the crew was English speaking. So we had American, English, French, German, Australian, but the language on set was English. So I'm directing in English, I'm discussing the roles in English and setting up the cameras in English. So it's only as soon as the camera rolls, everyone slips into whatever their character is supposed to be speaking. And obviously I know what everyone's saying because the script was written in English, 4 years ago. And I know every word of it. And even if you're not a great Spanish speaker, you can pretty much follow along. So in the end, I think it was a bonus, the fact that we shot in all the original languages. And I think the audience now for TV and streaming is much more used to having sections that are subtitled, or even if they just want to click over to their own language. But I don't think there's that prejudice anymore about shooting in languages that are appropriate for that, where the program comes from.
So I always have a little fun question at the end, and we will get to that, but I don't want to leave the main body of the chat without talking about one of the great moments in British, if not world, cultural history, which is your earlier era in music videos, which you touched on. But that does include the legend that is Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. Could you have had any notion that that song would have become such a massive song in its time and then come back again and created an internet phenomenon?
No, I mean, there's no way you can really. I mean, I was shooting, many music videos, and it was one of a whole clutch of them. And I was going in every week and shooting another one, and it was sort of one, off the line. And it was only later, after I'd made it, in the following year, I'd be traveling all around the world. I'd be in Australia, and it would pop up on TV as number one there. Or I'd go to Germany, it would pop on them, and you go, "Good God, that song is like everywhere. You can't get away from it." And it was like, the smallest, cheapest little video I shot in one night, basically one day and one night. And Is no way. And then you think it's gone. And then 30 years later, this, phenomenon pops up. And suddenly you've got, one of the highest video views on YouTube. And my kids are going, do you realize you've got, 1.5 billion views on YouTube? I go, I know. It's, it's strange. Nothing you can predict.
So just to finish off, I've moved away from asking people about their lockdown media, but I'm thinking of different ways of how to capture those thoughts. So if you found yourself circumnavigating the globe by boat, choosing one from each category, which film, book, music choice, and TV box set would you choose to get you through the journey?
Well, I don't think one film is going to get you through the whole circumnavigation of the earth. It took 3 years for Magellan to get around. So you need quite a lot of movies. But, so it's pretty mean to have one. But a film I do love is Withnail and I, with Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann. And funny, when I mention it in the States a lot of people in the States don't know, although a few people I've worked with in the film business can repeat lines back to me. But that's one film I would love to see. And I guess with books, especially as I'm mad on boats, and that's half the reason I ended up doing Magellan. I'm actually descended from Captain Bligh. So the book I probably have would be the Bounty Trilogy, Nordoff and Hall, written in 1932. It's like the best account of the whole thing. But I'd sort of sneak in 3 Men in a Boat as well, because that's like, you can read that in an hour or something. So and it's very funny. So it's a very quick read, as opposed to the Bounty Trilogy, which is like 3 books. Music, I'd actually probably take my daughter's music. She's a singer-songwriter and has a band. So I would take hers to remind me of the great music my daughter does.
Name names so that people.
Her name's Lily West, and her band is La 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 La. And she's just got an album out called I Want the Door to Open. So I'd take that. Or going along that Squeeze from the 80s, that band, the Squeeze. I love that. Up the Junction, yeah. You don't hear it anymore, but they were the Beatles of the 80s. And then box set, I'm quite nostalgic then. So I do like all these old things, and rather than, I'm not going to say, the new box set of whatever was out this year. So I'd like to go way back. So I'd like to get the Prisoner from the 60s, the Prisoner TV series. And, those in those days, they'd sort of make 12 episodes and that was it. But nowadays, we get hundreds of episodes, but that's what I would take with me.
Fantastic. Well, Simon West, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I suppose, to quote Squeeze, I never thought it would happen, but made it on. And I, of course, never want to give you up, but it has come to the end, and probably time to put the bunny back in the box. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I will look forward to being Boundless on Amazon.
Well done. Well done getting those quotes in. Yes. No, it's my pleasure. Great to talk to you.